everyone, and welcome back to Tea Time Thoughts. I'm Kaylin, as always, and I'll catch you up a little bit on a bit of what's happening with me at the moment. I have finally moved over to the UK, and I've started my grad school program, and I am absolutely loving it. I am having such a blast. I'm enjoying my classes a lot. For those of you that don't know, I'm doing a master's in museum and gallery studies at Kingston University, and I am very passionate. As you guys know, I'm very passionate about history and being able to share history with people. So this has just such a great experience for me so far, and I'm currently quarantining at the moment. I'm about a week in, but a week from now I'll be out loose and free to roam about and cause ruckus throughout London. So to all my listeners out in the UK, keep an eye out for me because I'm about to go wild on all the different opportunities out there for me. So I'm currently staying at an Airbnb with my mom. She came over with me to help me get settled. And after our 2 weeks of quarantine are over, we're going to do some traveling through England together. We haven't solidified everything on our schedule yet, but we definitely want to go antiquing, visit Kensington Palace, and the Museum of London. I have a huge list of museums and sites that I want to check out. And of course, things are still somewhat in the process of opening up, but there are just so many different things that I can look forward to. So I know I feel like I said this a million times since I've even just started recording this, but I am very excited, and there's going to be a lot that I can do to perhaps even find some interesting content for new episodes. I think that my surroundings are going to be really great to provide inspiration for some of future discussions that we'll be able to have here. So usually in the podcast, we haven't done something quite like this. Usually we're a bit more focused on one singular topic, and sometimes I'll go on tangents to help provide insights or background into understanding what's going on, but I haven't really taken the time to discuss just some things that I personally enjoy about history, and rather than delivering something that's more informational, just sort of me kind of geeking out over some of my favorite time periods. So if you don't enjoy this format all that much, don't worry, I'll be coming up with a different episode next week. If you do enjoy it, then please let me know, and I'll develop some other episodes like this that we can do in the future. And one thing I wanted to add as well, I have heard from a couple of friends back home that they would be interested in seeing a little bit of my day-to-day life over in the UK, so I might start filming some vlogs to put on my YouTube channel. If you're not already following that, the channel is Tea Time Thoughts Podcast, and I won't promise that the vlogs will be a regular thing. It'll probably depend on how busy I am, because of course being in school is something that's going to occupy a lot of your time, especially with having to research case studies for a master's thesis. But if I do end up making some vlogs, I will be sure to notify you guys on here and notify everybody on my Instagram page as well. And if you're not following the Instagram page, it's at Tea Time Thoughts Podcast. So that being said, let's get into my favorite time periods in history. Oh, and I almost forgot my tea. So today I'm having I'm not entirely sure what this is. It tastes almost like a dandelion tea. Our Airbnb host provided us with some teas, and I left the majority of my tea collection over at my house in the US. So I'm having this right now, and it's actually quite good. I was worried that it might be a bit bitter, but it's good. It's supposed to be a detox tea too, so I'm feeling replenished already. Let's get into it. My favorite time periods in history. So first one, right off the bat, I thought we would go in something of a chronological order. I'm sure I'll go on tangents as I go, but I have always really been interested in ancient Egypt. When I was a little girl, I think a lot of people may have developed an interest in history from something like this, but I really, really enjoyed the Magic Treehouse series. They used to do, it was kind of like a miniature book fair at our school, but it was called an AR fair. So we used to have an AR fair, which was, well, we only did this for about 1 year or so, but we used to have an AR fair, and AR stood for Accelerated Reader, and basically it was like a point system that they would have us do throughout elementary school. When we would read a book, we could type a code that was written onto it into a computer and take an AR test, and it would test our comprehension of the book and basically ask you questions about what happened. And there were all these different levels of AR books that you could read. It ranged throughout different colors of the rainbow. Like a red one was a very easy, simple picture book, something kind of like a bit more advanced than the Very Hungry Caterpillar, to Harry Potter books perhaps being a blue sticker or purple sticker. So one of the things I was able to buy with some of my points were a couple copies of some books from the Magic Treehouse series, and the first one I went for was, I think it was Monday with a Mummy, something like that, but I was super intrigued with Egyptian history, despite the fact that mummies themselves used to absolutely terrify me. I was deathly afraid of them, but I so wanted to kind of gather up my courage one day and be able to go and explore tombs. And I wanted to be something kind of like an archaeologist and discover King Tut's tomb, but there were two problems with that. First of all, I eventually learned this later. King Tut's tomb was already discovered because Howard Carter did that back in the early 20th century. And number two, I used to think because of Indiana Jones that... that if you ever became an archaeologist, that the Nazis would be on your tail constantly and try to murder you for discovering things. So that kind of spooked me for a while. But that was one of the things that definitely got me interested in ancient Egypt, just kind of being able to read about it. I've mentioned clue finders on here before, but I had 4th grade clue finders that would let you kind of go through and learn about ancient Egypt and interact with some of the characters that are the gods in the Egyptian mythology universe. And that was something that really developed my interest in it. And then in the 6th grade, when we went over ancient Egypt in the history section, I loved it. I aced it because I was so eager to study everything about it. We even did this activity once where we took gauze and kind of Mod Podged it onto this cardboard mask or something, so we can make like a mask, almost like a death mask, but like with a mummy aesthetic to fit our faces. And I had so much fun. The way they did it, they had us lay down on the floor and we'd have somebody help us kind of like press the mask down and stuff. When I laid down, I wanted to really get into the experience, so I laid down flat on my back and I crossed my hands over my chest like they would have a mummy do. And I kept my hands there the entire time. But I was always really interested in ancient Egyptian art and the sort of engravings they would have on or inside tombs, the sort of pictures you see of people facing sideways and holding scepters. I always thought that was really interesting. And, you know, of course, ancient Egypt has a lot of very interesting golden artifacts. And as a kid who loves shiny things too, and honestly, I'm still a kid that loves shiny things, that's a lot of fun. So that's consistently still been a favorite time period in history for me, although I haven't studied it quite as in depth as some of the ones that I've gotten into more recently. All right, so next, this one is probably very obvious to everybody already, especially if you've seen my first episode. Tudor England, I have always found incredibly fascinating. And I also mentioned Elizabethan England as well, so this can kind of be looped together. So this is English history from about 1485 to 1603. And this is such a juicy piece. This is such a juicy time period in history because we have Bloody Mary, we have Henry VIII, we have Queen Elizabeth I, and even the somewhat overlooked monarchs of this time period are really interesting too. Henry VII, who's the founder of the Tudor time period, he's got a lot of controversy surrounding him. For instance, everybody's always kind of accepted that Richard III's probably killed the two princes in the Tower, but it's possible that Henry VII might have been responsible for that. And if you don't know quite what I'm talking about here, that's totally fine because I'm planning on doing a podcast episode on the Lost Princes in the Tower in the future, and these are the sort of things I'll discuss. So I'll be sure to keep that on my list of episodes that I'm going to do. And Edward VI, he was the boy king that came to the throne at age 9 and he died at 15. But already in his reign, he was so determined to Protestantism a solid part of English society. So even though he died very young, he was very steadfast in determining what he was going to do. And it's just incredible to think about perhaps what England might look like if he had lived longer. And of course, one of the fun parts of Tudor history is to study Henry VIII and his wives. I think that's something that everybody can kind of find some interest in, even if you're not really interested in history. I think it's funny for people to think about a big fat man who killed his wives. I think that's something that would grasp interest for a lot of people. And of course, people know about Bloody Mary, but mostly I would say people know the name of Bloody Mary. I don't think they necessarily know much about her as a ruler as much as the myth of going in front of the mirror and saying Bloody Mary 3 times and then she'll show up and try to kill you. And then when it comes to Queen Elizabeth I, she's such an icon that even if you don't really know much about her, you can usually kind of summon some sort of image of her, usually wearing very large collars or with very kind of heart-shaped hair and white pasty makeup that happened to be very laced with lead and was not good for your skin at all. And the more you wore, the more you had to wear. Maybe that's another episode I can do in the future, because so much of the makeup they used was not good for you. But I think Tudor and Elizabeth in England are so fascinating because there's a lot of espionage and treason taking place. There's a lot of debacle over religion. There's romance. There's heartbreak. There is fashion. Fashion with a capital F, because, Queen Elizabeth snapped on all of us. I don't know if that's how the kids say it, but that's how I'm gonna say it. She was a queen in all that she did and in all that she wore as well. Oh, my goodness. There are essays written about significance and symbolism of so many of the things that she wore, so you can get an idea of how important the fashion was during the time. And I don't think I can emphasize enough how cool this period is. And as a historian, it's kind of a basic time period to study, but I love it. And, I don't care if it's basic. It makes me happy. So next on the list I have Baroque France. And if you're somebody who enjoys being extra, this is the time period for you. Everything about Baroque was basically making it as big and as extravagant as you can. Obviously, the first thing that comes to mind is the Palace of Versailles, which in and of itself is this massively extravagant building. And the fashion. Oh my gosh, you guys, if I could go back in time, or if I could dress like a certain time period in history, oh my gosh, I would totally want to deck myself out in these big silky gowns and see how tall I can get my hair to be and stick a sailboat inside it. Oh my goodness, I would have such an incredible time. And the music for this time period is interesting as well. I tend to favor Mozart a bit more, but you have the likes of Bach coming forward and Handel, and we're starting to see something of a rise in opera and in theater as well, and even a beginning rise in ballet. So there's a lot of interesting things that are kind of starting to come together here. And as they always say, if it ain't Baroque, don't fix it. I'm sorry. And so next on my list, I'd originally written Imperial Russia, but I want to extend this out to basically the whole of the Romanov dynasty in Russian history. And technically it started in 1613, so it would be a bit behind Baroque France, but considering that it ended in 1917, or you could argue 1918, it depends on whether you're going by the official end of the monarchy or the murder of the last Romanov family. I felt like since the end of it was much more recent, that it should go next on the list. Anyway, but again, I think you can kind of tell that if something in history is extra, then I'm gonna go out there, but you could not write a drama better than the history of the Romanovs. It is filled with deceit, it's filled with murder, it's filled with love and romance, it's filled with hate and poisonings, it's filled with assassination, it's filled with backstabbing and betrayals, and oh my goodness, it is a wild ride from start to finish. And I'm reading a book currently called The Romanovs by Simon Sebag Montefiore, and I am obsessed with it. From the very beginning, it just absolutely grips you, even though the first sentence itself is so simple. It says, "It was very hard to be a czar." And that's so real because if you look at, there were about 21 official Romanov czars that most historians would agree on. Out of those, a good chunk of them were assassinated, or a good chunk of them came to the throne by dodgy means. Even Catherine the Great, one of our favorite figures in history, she wasn't even Russian. She was a German princess that married the heir to the Russian throne and eventually overthrew her husband for being the terrible person that he was. And the people that we called the great in these time periods, or the people that we assign these names to, they usually have such interesting stories to them. So we have Peter the Great, who is known for all these great steps to westernize Russia, but he was also something of a madman. He was sadistic, he was very violent and quick to take revenge, but he was also very eager to party, and he was very intelligent and very eager to learn and better his people. We have Alexander II, who had 7 assassination attempts on his life, and he was told this by a fortune teller, and after the 7th assassination attempt, he thought he was safe, only to be murdered by an assassin who threw a bomb at him. And then you have, of course, Nicholas II, and you have Alexei with the hemophilia that can't be cured. You have Rasputin coming in to heal him. You have Anastasia, who seems to have mysteriously reappeared throughout history, but then was disproved to be dead throughout all this time. And it's just a jackpot, and it spans throughout so much history. And I can promise you, you will not be bored by looking into Russian history. It's incredible. Like, for crying out loud, Peter the Great didn't know that wheelbarrows were a thing until he visited England, and this was well into the 1600s. He and his friends were so excited to see this wheelbarrow that they jumped into it, and they were giving each other rides, and they were plowing through hedges in this wheelbarrow. Like, come on, even that story alone is just so crazy interesting. Or about the time that he didn't realize that Western European women wore corsets. So when he danced with German women at a ball, he thought that they had different bones than Russian women because they had hard waists. All I'm saying is, you're in for a treat. Okay, so next, of course, we have Revolutionary France. So this is a bit after the Baroque period, and of course this is the period in which multiple people are being executed by guillotine, and we're seeing the death of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, and we're starting to see the rise of Napoleon as well. And this is just a period in history that I find very fascinating as far as how quickly revolutions can go wrong, and also what the scramble for power is like afterwards. I think this is something that we see in a lot of revolutions, and there's a macabre part of me that just finds the politics behind it so interesting, and honestly finds just like the specter of the guillotine something that's very morbidly interesting. I think that this revolution is something that sets up France for a 19th century of difficulty and uncertainty as far as politics. They go from having an emperor to having another king. They are going back and forth about what to do. They have war with Germany eventually. They have a communist battle going on internally within Paris. And it's something that if you study, you can easily kind of see the footstools of history being set down. And next on my list, to kind of accompany this time of uncertainty, we have Romantic era France. And one of my favorite classical authors is Victor Hugo. I've read the unabridged version of Les Mis, and I actually, when I was 16, I went to an antique store with my mom and my grandma, and we found a collection of Victor Hugo books that were published in 1888 with some of the illustrations and everything still kind of intact. And they got that for me for my Sweet 16 present, and I was honestly so excited. Obviously I couldn't bring those books over with me to the UK, but I love those books. I think they're absolutely incredible. And of course there are other artists besides Victor Hugo that are really fascinating during this time, and not even just authors. We have Chopin rising during this time, we have Liszt, we have painters coming forward, we have Monet and Van Gogh and Gauguin starting to step forward and develop this really interesting style of Impressionism. And there's this revolution in art kind of taking place because now that the camera's starting to become more commonly used and people are getting their portraits taken in a realistic way, they have to try to create art in a way that will interest people, that will catch their attention. They have to kind of look into a new way to portray the world and to see the world. And it's a change that's very interesting to see. And there's also just this fascinating, almost sort of defeatist attitude of a lot of these artists. I think when we think of a lot of like the image of the starving artist or the tortured artist, I think has roots in this French Romanticism period, because Romanticism, when we think about it, I discussed this a little bit in the Wordsworth video, it's something that isn't more romantic in the lovey-dovey sense. It's romantic as in picturing the beauty around you in a very amplified way. And one thing I think was romanticized a lot during this time period is the idea of death. Because with all these wars and revolutions going on, and because these wars and revolutions are becoming more and more deadly, people are trying to acquaint themselves more with the idea of death. And if they're looking at something through this romanticist view where they try to see more of the beauty in it, there's going to be this romanticization of death as well. And this is something that we see roots of in the 20th century as well. We see a lot of very similar tormented and tortured art that takes place during World War I and shortly after, when the world has gone through a very catastrophic event and they're trying to determine what life means from there. And then finally, to wrap things up, I'm kind of bunching these two together, but I find World War I and World War II both very interesting. And I think especially when you talk to somebody who doesn't know a lot about history, I think everybody kind of has a general interest in World War II. As far as big historical events, it's one that is fairly recent in the timeline of history, of course. In the span of one person's lifetime, it might not seem that recent, but if we're overlooking thousands and thousands of years of history, it is something that is still relatively new. But regarding World War I, especially as somebody who grew up in the United States, it's something that I didn't really learn as much of the significance of until later, because the United States entered World War I pretty late, and it wasn't really until I did my study abroad to the UK that I was able to see just how much World War I had impacted the people and how much of its history really was significant to the people of not only the UK but also of Europe. There were so many populations of young men that were just decimated from this catastrophic war. And this is something that, again, kind of like the Romanticism period, it leaves room for a lot of doubt and a lot of questioning. People aren't sure about what life is meant to be after something this catastrophic. So not only is this war fascinating to discover from a military standpoint, but from an artistic standpoint, from a political standpoint, an emotional and social standpoint, there are so many significant changes and significant thoughts and ideas and actions that are worth looking into, because at the same time that this takes place, it's setting the foundation for World War II within a few decades of World War I. And the consequences of a lot of these wars still exist in our world today. We just kind of have to keep an eye open and look around at what's going on and perhaps dig a little bit deeper. But there are concessions that have been made in fashion due to the impact of these wars. There are political practices that are still maintained because of this. There are things that we have realized that we needed to do, or things that we need to prevent after wars like these. These are wars that we look back on, despite how much interest we have in them, we look back on them as things that we really wish to never happen again. But of course, people are always quick to say that history repeats itself. So a lot of us would consider it important to go back and familiarize ourselves with these events and look into how wars and events like these can be prevented. And you might be surprised to see how much of the times then also resemble what life is like for us today. So that's it for today. Thank you very much for listening. Again, if you enjoyed this episode, you can like, comment, subscribe, follow. Each platform is a little bit different. If you want to rate this podcast, you can go to ratethispodcast.com/teatimethoughts. I would really appreciate it if you did so. Leaving a review or a rating helps to boost the podcast, and it helps to spread our discussions with other people that might want to participate. You can also follow the podcast Instagram page at Tea Time Thoughts Podcast, or you can subscribe to us on YouTube. I also post our episodes up there as well, and there are currently no ads on there, so you can listen to it completely uninterrupted. If you have any ideas for future episodes that you'd like to recommend, please feel free to do so. I welcome any ideas or feedback that you might have. Thank you again for listening. This is Tea Time Thoughts, and I'll talk to you next week.